All right, good evening. Thank you so much for being with us again tonight. It's a privilege to have you. Those that are joining via live stream, appreciate you being with us as well. As we continue to look at standing on solid ground, trying to apply the Bible to current events, the last couple of weeks we've been looking at climate change. We're going to continue tonight to look at the science. And then unless something happens and the Lord changes my mind, we're going to move to the next piece of this, and that's what does the Bible say in regards to all of this? And, how do we, from a biblical standpoint, need to deal with it? But tonight we are going to talk a little bit more about the science. I want to show you as best I can that a lot of the information that you hear in the popular media, whether it's the Weather Channel or Discovery Channel or in the newspapers or magazines or whatever, what you hear is not necessarily what is really going on behind the scenes. And I'm going to show you several different data points in regards to that tonight, just to show you that it's not just one little isolated incident. So we're going to get into that in just a second, but let's go ahead and go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll jump right in. All right, Father, we do love you, and we thank you so much for the privilege and the opportunity that we have to be in your house again tonight. Father, how we thank you for the truth of your word and how that we can use the word of God to help us to navigate the things that we find going on in our world. Father, we've looked at this at a number of topics over the last year or so that we've seen the Bible applies to each and every one of them, and as we're going to see, it applies to climate change and radical environmentalism as well. So, Father, I pray that you just use me tonight to share some of the data that's really out there. And then, Father, next week as we really dive into what the Bible says, I pray that it'll help pull all the parts and pieces together and help us to be the witness that you'd have us to be. Father, I thank you once again for the privilege to serve you. Thank you for each and every person that's joined us, whether it's here or online. Father, I pray that you just bless our time together. We'll give you the praise and glory for all that you do. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen and amen. All right. Well, as we've said, we've been talking about climate change and getting to the point where we can understand how to apply the Bible to this particular topic. But we've talked a little bit about the science and tried to lay down a few basic principles. But tonight we're going to look at some data. I've done my best to put it in the form of charts and graphs or copy charts and graphs from other people who've done it. To make it a little bit easier to understand, a little bit easier to kind of see what I'm talking about. There are going to be some quotes here. We do have a short video at one point because I want everybody to rest assured that the polar bears are not dying out. So we'll show you a little bit of video about the polar bears toward the end of this thing to let you see that as well. But like I said, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Like I said, right now we're looking at what additional information is important, and we're specifically talking about the science at this point. Now, when we talk about the science of climate change or global warming, we have to start out by realizing that there are two different aspects of information that we have to pay attention to. One is observational data, and the other is modeling data. Satellite data and ocean probes give us real-time data as to what's going on in relation to the temperature of the water, the temperature of the air, how much CO2 is in the air, and all of those kind of things. They're measurable quantities that help us to at least know what's there. You can also go back to historical records where people have kept, I'm 53, and, I can remember watching the weather and stuff with my mom and dad on the 6 o'clock news. When everybody watched the news at the same time, or you missed it all day. But the 6 o'clock news, you always had the weather people on there, and they'd tell you what the temperature was today and what it was a year ago and the highest and the lowest. And we've been keeping that data for over 100 years in a lot of cases. And so all of those things would be considered observational data. All right? It's something we've observed, it's something that we've measured, and it's something that we've written down somewhere. All right? Now, from that data, you can build all kinds of maps or charts or other kind of tools that'll let you know what's happened in the past and that, the things that we've measured, and also what's going on now. And like I said, All of that falls under the category of observational data. Now, you can take that observational data and then you can use that to create models. And what a model does, observational data looks at the stuff that's right there. Models, what they do is they predict what's going to happen. They say, okay, we've been looking at this data point, temperature, average temperature of the world for 100 years. And we know it's been like this, and we've seen it start creeping up, or we've seen it start creeping down, and because of that, we'll create this model that'll tell us, is it going to keep going down, is it going to keep going up, or whatever. So we use the observational data as a starting point for the models. But here's the difference. Models, like I said, are predictions. They're not actual observations. And the models that they build have all kinds of different assumptions built into them, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So we'll create this model with all of these different ideas or assumptions about what could happen, and we build that into the model, and then we say, okay, this is what we think is going to happen. Now, to kind of put this into perspective, I'm going to use something that we see starting about this time of year. There's already been one moving its way this way right now, and that's hurricane data. Okay? There's two kinds of models for hurricanes, basically. There's what they call the spaghetti model, and then there's the cone model. Okay? Spaghetti model is that. If you've ever watched the Weather Channel when a hurricane's coming in, especially in the early phases of the predictions, this is what you see. You'll see the hurricane over here, and then you see or the tropical storm, whatever it happens to be, and then you see all of these lines, and that's why they call it a spaghetti model. Each one of those lines is what that model says that hurricane's probably going to do. Now look at that. There's a bunch of lines up there. And the reason that there's a bunch of lines is because each model that's represented by one of those colors, each of those models has different assumptions built into it. One may say that the jet stream doesn't play a big role. Another might say it plays the biggest role of all. Another model might say it's got to do with the precipitation in the air. Another model says it ain't got anything to do with the precipitation in the air, or it's not got very much to do with it. So they build these models, and they put all of these numbers into the equations, and they say, tell me what this hurricane's going to do. And so depending on what you put into the model determines what you get out. If you think something is important in your model, then it's going to have a bigger level of control on what you see. So that's why when they do these models on Weather Channel, they show you, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different models. There's a European model, there's an American model, there's a couple of college models, university models, and those kind of things. But they all use different assumptions in the model, and that's why you see so many different lines, okay? Now, the closer that the hurricane gets, they switch from a spaghetti model to what they call a cone model. And because it's getting closer and you've had more time to observe speeds and all of this kind of stuff as it gets closer to land, you can start predicting a little bit closer maybe what this thing is going to do. And that's where you see these cone models. And the reason it's called a cone model is because here's where they think it's going to go, the black line. But you see that big loop all the way around it. That's the cone. It could go that way. It could go this way. Anywhere within that cone. Again, these are models. They've got numbers that they're crunching. They've got particular assumptions that says when the hurricane gets closer to land and the water temperature changes and all of those kind of things, that the hurricane behaves differently. So the closer you get to land, most of the time, the more accurate the models get. But they still give you this huge cone that says it could do any of these things based on the models. We're just not sure, but we think this is the most likely path that it's going to take. So this is Hurricane Dorian in 2019. So you saw the spaghetti model, you've seen the cone model. This is the observational data. This was after the fact. And they plotted where that hurricane was against satellite data, and that's what the Hurricane Dorian actually did, okay? And it fit relatively close it definitely fit within the cone. Let's put it that way. It didn't hit exactly like what they said it was going to do, but it was relatively close. It hit within the cone. But if you go all the way back to the early predictions, that thing could have gone anywhere. So that's the difference between observational data and actual models which just predict what's going to happen. Okay? Observational data is hard data. You've measured it, you know what you got. Models are predictive. You think this is what it's going to do based on the things that you think are important and how that thing should act. Okay? Now, when it comes to climate change, there is exactly the same scenario. You have observational data and you have models. Okay? And what we've seen to date when it comes to climate change is that the models are wildly different than what the observational data is. The models say a lot of stuff, and they all say things are going to be, well, most of them say the thing is going to be really, really bad. But the observational data isn't telling us quite the same thing. Here is a spaghetti model of climate change. Now, before on that spaghetti model right there, there's probably 20 different models. This one's got 73. So there's 73 spaghetti strands, plus the average of the spaghetti strands. And then it's also got the observational data, so you can see just how much different the real data is from the models. All right? Not making this stuff up. 73 spaghetti models. And it lists every one of them in that box up there. But from here to here is what they say the models tell you climate change is going to do. The dark black line is the average of all the models. The blue and green dots are satellite and balloons data. This is actually observational. This is the models. And the observation says there's not been a whole lot of change. The models say it can go wild. But the actual observational data is still right down here at 0, or right close to it, which means there's not been a whole lot of change. So that's the first thing you have to understand. When you hear this stuff, the climate change models tell us that blah, blah, blah is going to happen. It's a model. It is not data. It is a model. It is a prediction. It uses data on the front end to get it started. But then it's all about the assumptions that you build into the model. Depends on how. So if you think climate change is really, really bad, what kind of assumptions are you going to build into your model? If you think that climate change is kind of meh, what kind of assumptions are you going to build into your model? That's why you can't just go by the models. You have to look at the actual data itself. Now, here's the sad thing. It's not the observational data that's driving policy decisions in governments around the world. It's the models. As wildly bad as they have proven to be, it's still the models that they're using to say this is what we need to do about climate change. All right? Now, this is from Roy Spencer. He's got the book right here. And again, if you want to see this, if you want to see a lot more, learn a lot more about this just from the science standpoint, this little book, Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People, is fantastic. This guy worked for NASA in the weather department. So he actually, starting in '79, he was actually a team lead for some of the satellite data looking at the ice caps. Okay, so it's not like he doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, but this is Roy Spencer, and this is what he says about the models versus the data. The climate models used to justify changes in energy policy produce twice as much atmospheric warning as has been observed since 1979 by satellites. Why 1979? Because that's when the satellites were first used for this, okay? 79. weather balloons, and reanalysis assessments of a variety of global weather data. In other words, since '79, when they really started tracking this from a satellite perspective, the models are twice as bad as reality, okay? Now, the question is, why are the models, like I said, so different from reality? Well, like I said, a lot of it's got to do with the assumptions you build into the models. But Spencer goes on to say this: computerized climate models, often containing hundreds of thousands of lines of computer code, provide the quantitative basis for proposed reductions in carbon dioxide emissions to limit global warming. But here it is. But one of the dirty little secrets of the climate modeling business is that models cannot reproduce natural climate change. In fact, when those models are constructed, they're adjusted so they do not produce any natural climate change. Any long-term temperature trend is considered to be what modelers call spurious model drift and is programmed out based upon the assumption that the climate system doesn't change naturally on the time scale of hundreds of years. Since the climate modelers don't understand the cause of natural climate cycles, let alone be able to model them, they revert to what they do know. Humans are producing carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning, and we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So it's easy to blame CO2 for recent warming, especially when you can't think of any other causes. So we have this curious situation where models that cannot simulate natural climate change, but are programmed to be dominated by human-induced climate change, are used as proof that only humans can cause climate change. This is an example of circular reasoning, or a tautology. Modelers point to their models as evidence of what they assumed to begin with. Now, let me just put that in a real short nutshell. There is no model that has the assumptions built in, this is how nature acts on its own. There's not one. Why? Because they don't know how nature acts on its own in relation to something like this. So they call all of that data out of the system, and the only thing they count is CO2 emissions by people, and then tell you the reason climate change is happening is because CO2 emissions from people. Sweet little gig. The models themselves don't model anything real. They just model the one thing they're designed to model, is how much impact is CO2 by humans going to have on the temperature. That's all they model. Physicist Freeman Dyson says the same thing. I have studied the climate models, and I know what they can do. The models solve the equations of fluid dynamics, and they do a very good job of describing the fluid motions of the atmosphere and the oceans. They do a very poor job of describing the clouds, the dust, the chemistry, and the biology of fields and farms and forests. They do not begin to describe the real world that we live in. Now, don't you think if you were going to change the way the world operates by getting rid of fossil fuels, you would want a model that might actually have something to do with the real world? But the models don't. The real world is muddy and messy and full of things that we do not yet understand. It is much easier for a scientist to sit in an air-conditioned building and run computer models than to put on winter clothes and measure what's really happening outside in the swamps and the clouds. That's why the climate model experts end up believing their own models. So, think about this for just a minute. The models that are used to convince the public and governments that climate change is this imminent, world-ending threat don't in any way reflect what's going on in the real world. Not even a little bit. They only model the percentage increase of CO2 in the air and how much that alone will impact temperature. And since man is the cause of the majority of the CO2 increase, in their view, then global warming is man's fault, and the consequences will be dire if we don't cut back on our emissions. But it ignores all the other stuff, things like cloud formation, things like plant growth, things like atmospheric dust. So it's no wonder, when you really look at it, that the models are so wrong. And the United Nations and governments around the world are basing, including the U.S., are basing climate change policy on models that aren't right and emotional pleas from teenagers like Greta Thunberg that we talked about before. Now, as we said before, climate change alarmism, all of this stuff about the models and everything else, is pushed as science fact. Every summer for the last several years, we hear statements like, this is the hottest day ever on record in the month of July. And then immediately followed by, and we know it's because of global warming, somewhere in the sentence or somewhere in the paragraph. And admittedly, it gets hot in the summer. But does that mean that because we have a hot day or even a hot week or even a hot couple of weeks, does that mean that it's automatically tied to climate change? That's the problem. For instance, the EPA, now the data that I'm going to show you from this point on with all the charts and everything else, these are not Christians. These are government agencies for the most part. And I went to their websites and pulled the data. In some cases, I actually had to pull the data and create a chart because they didn't even have the chart. They just had the data. So, but this is based strictly on government data. So you can't say, and we can't say, and nobody else can say that the government doesn't know this stuff. All right? The EPA has data on their website that there's not been any change in the heat wave index in 140 years. Now, if you look at this chart for just a second, you see this huge spike in the 1930s. Now, I say huge, but when you look at it, it's a difference of about 1.4 degrees. Okay, remember we talked about the scale thing? so it looks like a huge spike, but here it is. That was during the Dust Bowl years. Okay? Here, it goes flat from about 1958 to almost 1980. Remember me talking about when in the 1970s that they were talking about all the evidence points to the fact that we're going to fall into another ice age? That's the data. Because it leveled out and was lower than they had seen in decades, it must be going to get cold. So, but for 140 years, and this data is good up to 2020, for 140 years, the heat wave index in the U.S. has not changed. It just bounces up and down a little bit, year to year, decade to decade. No big surprise, but if you look at it, the line's flat as you look at it. As an example, in July of 2018, again, it's all in how you couch the data or how you present the data. In July of 2018, much of Europe and the western U.S. were hotter than the 30-year average. So every time they were talking about how hot it was in the month of July in 2018, can you not see that this is climate change? It's been hot for days. It's hotter than it's been on a 30-year average. It's got to be climate change. What they didn't tell you is that at the same time in other parts of the same world, it was actually cooler than it had been over the last 30 years. As a matter of fact, at the end of July, when you took the whole global temperature of the earth, it was 0.23 degrees C, which is roughly 3/4 of a degree Fahrenheit, hotter than the 30-year average. Why? Because it was just as cool or cooler in some places as it was hotter in others. And we all know how averages work. Okay? So it was just barely hotter in the end in July of 2018 on a global basis. It was just barely hotter than it had been over the last 30 years. So does that really sound like something to panic about? No. But they don't tell you the second part. They just tell you it's been hotter than it has in the last 30 years in this 1 month. Without telling you it's also been cooler down here. Other weather phenomena that are often attributed to climate change, and you hear this all the time, are droughts and floods, right? The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, otherwise known as NOAA, NOAA, regularly supplies data regarding the current state of droughts and excessive rainfall. On their website yesterday, I pulled this information. I told you, I try to be as current as I can. On a broad scale, the 1980s and 1990s were characterized by unusual wetness with short periods of extensive droughts. The 1930s and 1950s were characterized by prolonged periods of extensive droughts with little wetness. So do you get this idea of kind of something like this going on? And the first 2 decades of the 2000s saw extensive drought and extensive wetness. So I know this is going to be hard to understand. But what they've just said is weather changes. Sometimes it's wetter than it is other times. Sometimes it's drier than it is sometimes. Sometimes it's wet and dry, different than it has been. But they're basically saying weather changes. We've seen dry times. We've seen wet times. Now we're seeing wet times and dry times, depending on what part of the world you're in at the same time. Kind of strange, but hey, it happens. The following graphic, and again, this comes from their website, not some creationist sitting in a corner trying to chuck numbers to make it. This comes straight off their website. Shows that there's not been any real upward trend of droughts or excessive rainfall since 1900. Not a lot of change. You don't see real small over here and getting real big on the ends, right? It all just kind of bounces around because, again, oddly enough, weather changes. So when you hear on the Weather Channel, we know this drought's caused by global warming. No, they don't. As a matter of fact, the data says it's not surprising that there's a drought somewhere. We know that the floods that have flooded the Mississippi are caused by global warming. No, we don't. Floods happen, and they've happened forever. There is no data that shows, plenty of models, but no data that shows drought and excessive rainfalls are caused by climate change. This is the data, not the models. All right? Now, another thing that you hear every time there's a tornado, every time there's a hurricane. Climate change. We're seeing more hurricanes than we've ever seen. We're seeing more tornadoes than we've ever seen. No, we're not. Again, if you look at the data, that's not true. In March of 2022, again, can't get much closer than up to date, March 2022, a paper entitled Trend Analysis of U.S. Tornado Activity Frequency by researchers in the U.S. and Canada in a technical journal called Atmosphere said this in the introduction to the paper. Whenever severe tornado events occur, such as the recent tornado outbreaks that happened on 10/11 December 2021 over the U.S., the public and media often raise numerous questions related to tornadoes and their relationship with climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, now that's the UN organization, we'll maybe talk about that some next week, and the U.S. Climate Change Science Program have also drawn their attention to these questions, especially on how localized severe weather activities, such as tornadoes, are changed under a changing climate, even though it's challenging to identify the influences of climate warming on tornado activity. Catch that statement. We can't tell if it's caused by climate change or something else, right? This research helps answer some unknown or unresolved scientific questions of concern to the IPCC, U.S. Climate Change Program, and the public. So that's straight out of the introduction to the paper. What did they find when they did the testing and looked at all of the data? Tornadoes have actually been decreasing since 1954. Now, as you can see, the individual dots are the number of tornadoes in a year, all right? So it goes all the way back to 1954. But if you'll notice, so, there's been, one year there was almost 900, and that was that's 1970-ish, all right? But it's also been as low as 200 or around 300, right? But if you look, that blue line, if you start out there on that blue line on the end and you move your way to the right, that's called a trend line. And a trend line means if you take all of that data and throw it into an equation, it will tell you whether the dots are moving up or the dots are moving down. This is for EF1 through EF5 tornadoes. That's the whole range. Now, if you look at the individual data, and I will say this, if you look at the individual data for EF1, EF2, EF3, EF4, EF5, EF1s have actually seen a little bit of an increase in their frequency. But it's also been, at the same time, a lot less of the bigger storms. So overall, the trend on tornadoes is not increasing. Climate change, if anything, let's make the argument the other way and really tick people off. Climate change is causing less tornadoes. That's what the data looks like if I wanted to make that claim, right? So, when it comes to hurricanes, like I said, we've got one rolling right now. When it comes to hurricanes that have made landfall in the U.S. between 1851 through 2019, that's the latest data that I could pull together. Again, there's been a down, again, the dates, 1851 through 2019, downward trend. See the little red line? That's your trend line, just like I'm talking about a minute ago. Yep, some years you have more hurricanes, a lot of years you have less hurricanes. But the overall trend is that we've got less hurricanes. Oh, but the hurricanes we've had have been worse. Because global warming makes the water hotter, and that makes the hurricanes bigger. And we know that that's what it does. Nope. 1960s, and I'm just counting category 4s and 5s. Okay, because those are the big mamas, okay? 1960s, there was 3 category 4s, 1 category 5. 1970s, 1 category 4, no category 5. 80s, 1, 0. 90s, 0, 1. 2000s, 1, 0. 2010s, 2 and 1. Does it really look like we're seeing more dangerous hurricanes because of climate change? No. And this comes from government data. Like I said, I had to plot that graph because all it was numbers. So I had to go in and actually put the numbers into a spreadsheet so I could get that chart. But that right there is based straight off the numbers. So the storms not only they're not more of them that are hitting land, they're also no more dangerous than they've been. Researcher Roger Pilkey Jr. has shown that the number, now that's just U.S. Well, you're just looking at the U.S. numbers. That's a Western bias. You need to look at the global situation and look at how it looks at the globe, not just in the U.S. Okay. That's global. Notice the line? Still going down. So I can make an argument. Climate change is making less hurricanes, and they're less violent. That's what it looks like the data's showing. Not the models, the data. Now, I'm not saying, so somebody's going to see this and they'll kick me off YouTube, but I'm not saying that climate change means we've had less tornadoes and we've had less hurricanes. All I'm saying is I can use the same kind of logic that people who are saying it's causing more I can use the same kind of logic to say that it's using less, and at least mine's based on data and not models. Okay? So I'm not saying that's the only factor. I don't think it's the only factor anyway. I'm just showing you the data. Well, we know that hurricanes have cost us much more money over the last several decades. Well, yeah, to a degree. Number one, people like their beachfront homes. Are you really going to build a house right on the beach? Knowing that, Brother Larry's sitting back there going like this, knowing that you're in prime real estate for a hurricane. The answer to the question is, yeah, they do it all the time. That's why the dadgone beach houses are so expensive. Well, guess what happens? That beach house gets destroyed. It costs a lot more money to build it back. Does it mean, 60 years ago, there wasn't nearly as many houses on the beach as there are now. That's why it looks like the numbers are getting worse. But again, if you look at just raw numbers, yes, it looks like it's costing us a lot more money every time there's a hurricane that hits land. But if you look at it as a relation to the gross domestic product, the GDP of the U.S. and the GDP of the world, and you say, given how much more stuff costs now and how much more stuff there is it really costing us more, or hurricanes really costing us more? Guess what? Looks the same. It's going down. If you take the dollar value versus GDP. So even the argument that they're more costly is wrong. The frequency is wrong. The severity is wrong. They're all heading in the wrong direction if climate change is making things worse. Wildfires. Oh, this one we know it's got to be wildfires. If it's hot, stuff's going to burn easier. It's got to be wildfires. If there's going to be a data point that's going to show us global warming causes disasters, it's got to be wildfires. Weather Channel, on their website, said this just the other day. Climate change has increased. Now, this is a quote from Jacob Bendix, okay? Climate change has increased the frequency and severity of both drought and extreme high temperatures. You've just seen the data. Both of those statements are wrong. Okay? Climate change has increased the frequency and severity of both drought and extreme high temperatures, and both of these contribute to larger fires and more extreme fire behavior. Jacob Bendix, professor of geography and the environment at Syracuse University, told weather.com in an email earlier this summer. But I've done showed you the drought data. Nope. I've done shown you the severity of the temperature data. Nope. Neither one of those statements is true. According to researchers Dorr and Santine, and again, these are not climate deniers. These are people who are actually looking for data to support the story for climate change. Dorr and Santine, in an article published in Philosophical Transactions B of the Royal Society, said this about wildfires. Human societies have coexisted with fire since their emergence, yet many consider wildfire as an accelerating problem with widely held perceptions both in the media and scientific papers of increasing fire occurrence, severity, and resulting losses. However, and this article, by the way, is only 3 years old, of increasing fire occurrence, severity, and resulting losses. However, important exceptions aside, the quantitative evidence available does not support these perceived overall trends. So you have this professor of geography and the environment saying wildfires are getting worse because of climate change. And then here you got these two researchers looking at the data and saying, no. No, it's not. Instead, global area burned appears to have overall declined over past decades. And there is increasing evidence that there is less fire in the global landscape today than centuries ago. Regarding fire severity, limited data are available. For the western USA, they indicate little change overall, and also that area burned at high severity has overall declined compared to pre-European settlement. Direct fatalities from fire and economic losses also show no clear trends over the past 3 decades. Trends and indirect impacts, such as health problems from smoke or disruptions of social functioning, remain insufficiently quantified to be examined. Global predictions for increased fire under a warming climate highlight the already urgent need for a more sustainable coexistence with fire. The data evaluation presented here aims to contribute to this by reducing misconceptions and facilitating a more informed understanding of the realities of global fire. In other words, we really wish there was a trend that showed it was a problem, but we can't find it. So we got to look somewhere else. Ain't that amazing? You ever heard the expression that the reason that when you go to court, each team, the prosecutor and the defense, has their expert witness, and they'll completely contradict each other when they get up there? That's exactly what this is. Here you got this scientist of geography and environment saying, fires are getting worse and it's caused by climate change. Here's these other researchers going, no, the evidence don't show that anywhere. Even globally, it don't look like that's the case. But this is the one we've heard about now for decades. Sea level rise. The oceans are getting bigger and the water levels are getting higher and we're going to drown. In 2019, the New York Times published an article saying that South Vietnam would all but disappear because it would be underwater at high tide in just a few years. But the question is that true? Using tide gauge records, so these are floating tide monitors, kind of like the satellites and the balloons and all this kind of stuff. Church and White, these were the researchers, produced a chart in a paper showing sea level rise from 1880 to 2013. Now, here's the chart. That green line on this one is the trend line, all right? Now, for a long time, from 1880 to about 1960 to 1970, the tide going up and down pretty much followed that trend line. But all of a sudden, about 1970, 1980, you started seeing changes in the tide data as opposed to the trend line, right? And so what Church and White said is that this right here is caused by man. There's no other reason that the tides would change that much unless it was global warming, and because we've seen the ice caps melting, that's where that water's coming from and things like that. And so man is the cause of that change in the tide levels. Okay? That was their argument. But even, again, if you look at the scale and pay attention to what's on there, even if the rate of change was due to man and was due to global warming, and that's all it was due to, it amounts to about a 1-inch increase every 30 years. The tide gets an inch higher every 30 years. That doesn't sound like a catastrophe. And it's something that we could fix without having to make everybody go over to electric cars that they can't power. Bjorn Lomborg, who I've told you about, great book. Brother Allen was saying he's bought this book, read about 3 chapters of it so far. Bjorn Lomborg, who again, he's an economist. So he's not got any dog in the race from a climate science perspective. This is just him looking at the numbers. And this is what he says. In South Vietnam's An Giang province, almost all land that is not mountainous is protected by a dike. It's underwater already. The dikes are the only thing keeping it back. It is, let's see, It is underwater in the same way that much of Holland is. Large swaths of land, including Schiphol, the world's 14th largest airport, are quite literally built under the high tide mark. I've been to the Netherlands. I've been to Holland. I've seen the dikes. I've seen all, it's wild at the stuff. I've not flown out of Schiphol. I actually flew out of Amsterdam. But in London, almost 1 million people live below the high tide watermark level. But nobody in Holland, London, or the Mekong Delta needs scuba gear to get around because humanity has adapted with dikes and flood protection. The actual research on which the New York Times article is based mentions in its introduction, now this is the actual scientific article versus what the New York Times reported. The actual research on which the New York Times article is based mentions in its introduction that coastal defenses like dikes and dams are not considered in its approach. That's fine for an academic paper, but it's ludicrous for the media to use its findings to produce claims of 20 million people underwater, or for the campaigners to suggest that this gives us reason to all become alarmist. In other words, yeah, the water levels are rising an inch every 30 years. Worst comes to worst, let's build a dike. A 20-foot dike would prevent flooding for 10,000 years at that rate. Lomborg also, if you read the book, also shows that building dikes and flood protection mechanisms like that are actually a whole lot less expensive than what they're proposing with cutting global carbon emissions. So rising sea levels at the rates being experienced are not catastrophic either. But the Arctic is melting and the polar bears are dying. According to Spencer, who worked with NASA as a team lead on satellite imagery and measurements of the Arctic ice, there is clearly a decline in the ice. So this is one place where the ice really is getting thinner. But what's not clear is that it's because of man-made global warming. Why? Well, there's 2 lines of evidence that suggest there's more to the story. Spencer notes that in 1940, a Russian oceanography expert noted the decline in Arctic ice. Now, this was before man-made global warming would have been a contributor, and he's saying in 1940, these bad things were happening at the Arctic. Receding glaciers, rising air temperature, rising Atlantic waters entering the Arctic basin, which means that the ice would be melting from underneath. A decrease in ice abundance, changes in biology with fish ranging farther north and species appearing that had not been there previously, and ships being able to navigate farther north than previously possible. He said this in 1940 before global warming would have been an issue. So does that not indicate that if it's still going on now, it's probably not because of global warming, if it was already going on? He goes on to say, and this is Spencer, today such changes would have been blamed on CO2 emissions, yet this was well before humanity could have played a role. Clearly, the Arctic experiences large changes without the help of humans. This is just one more example of how premature the claims of an obvious human influence on climate really are. In addition, other research has shown that Arctic sea ice was actually lower than it is now during a period called the medieval warm period, and then it increased a great deal in what they called the Little Ice Age. This is this chart. Here, the sea ice was less than it is now. But then we started this cooling trend. Again, has nothing to do with global warming because there was nothing going on that would have contributed to it from or global cooling, either one, from man's perspective. But the temperatures began to drop, and as they dropped, the ice sheets got a lot thicker. Then in 1980, about 1700, they started creeping back up again. And then they started creeping, when the Industrial Revolution kicked in, they did start climbing even further. But again, if you look at the data, we're still only at the place where it's about the place it was 1,000 years ago or more. All right? So, yeah, the ice is melting, but it's been doing this and refreezing over and over again. Like we've said, weather changes. Life Science reported in 2013 that an ancient forest was being revealed as the Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska was melting. Now here's the picture. There's the glacier in the background where that tree stumps, those actual tree stumps are, that used to be Glacier. Now here's the question. If these trees had time to grow and get that large, and then get swallowed up by glaciers, and then the glaciers recede and you can still see the trunks, doesn't that tell you that for a prolonged period of time, where those trunks were was once warm? Warm enough to grow trees. And we're not talking about twigs, we're talking about trees, whole forests of trees. And again, those trees date right back to that medieval warm period that I was talking about. Now, another claim that was made by Al Gore, since he's a Tennessean, I had to throw him in there somewhere. Another claim made by Al Gore in his movie An Inconvenient Truth was that because the Arctic sea ice was receding, polar bear populations were decreasing, drowning, and starving. But the truth is, polar bear populations are increasing or very, very stable, and it's no longer used even by Al Gore as a talking point. When he published the sequel to his first movie, An Inconvenient Truth, the next one was called An Inconvenient Sequel was the second one. Somehow he forgot to mention the polar bears. This is why.
Since the start of this century, the polar bear has been the icon of human-caused global warming. But now, the polar bear as poster child of catastrophic global warming is dead. In years past, the polar bear was routinely featured in public discussions about the effects of climate change. But today, the polar bear is a much less common sight in the media and science. A number of recent climate change reports even failed to mention polar bears in their discussion of Arctic sea ice decline. The polar bear does not get mentioned once in the draft of the U.S. Climate Science Special Report, even in the 50-page discussion on changes in the Arctic. And NOAA's annual Arctic report card has not mentioned the polar bear since 2014, in spite of highlighting the dangers faced by bear populations in every issue since 2008.
So there is a faster buildup of heat here at the North Pole, in the Arctic Ocean, and the Arctic generally, than anywhere else on the planet. That's not good for creatures like polar bears who depend on the ice.
Even Al Gore seems to have forgotten to include the plight of polar bears in his newest climate change movie, though it had a prominent role in his 2007 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. The polar bear example was left out of An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. It doesn't even get a mention.
Don't let anybody tell you that we're going to get on rocket ships and live on Mars. This is our home.
After years of campaigners' and researchers' claims that populations were in terminal decline, the canary in the coal mine has been retired. It is now widely understood that polar bears are not suffering as predicted from years of low summer sea ice. There have been no new reports of falling polar bear numbers, and images of fat, healthy polar bears abound. Fat, healthy bears have been photographed around the Arctic on a regular basis in recent years, even in regions like Hudson Bay and Alaska, where the bears were once said to be most at risk due to sea ice loss. A 2015 attempt to use an image of a starving bear as a victim of climate change backfired when it became clear the animal had been injured and was dying a natural death. That same year, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature released its latest global estimate of polar bear population size. It was more bad news for the merchants of doom. According to the estimates, polar bear numbers had increased by about 2,000 since 2007. Since then, new or updated estimates of polar bear populations in other regions have added about 2,000 more bears to the global estimate. This is far from the dramatic decline in numbers the public was told to expect. In early 2007, American government biologists insisted that a persistent drop in summer sea ice to about 5 million square kilometers or less would cause the loss of about 20,000 bears. They said this was likely to happen by the year 2050. But sea ice declined much more rapidly. The summer of 2007 brought to the Arctic the mid-century ice conditions scientists had predicted, and they have remained at these low levels since then. In spite of this earlier than expected sea ice decline, there has been no associated decrease in global polar bear numbers. Not a single one of the 10 at-risk subpopulations have been wiped out as predicted, and none have even declined in size.
The bears have been out here on the tundra since the ice broke up in July. Now, typically, this is the bears' hungry season. The problem is, under climate change, that season is getting longer, and the bears are finding it harder to survive.
The health of polar bears, despite a decade of low sea ice, makes this species extremely unhelpful to climate change campaigns.
Polar bears live in the Arctic, on the ice. But the ice is melting because of global warming.
It was hoped that stories about polar bear suffering might encourage public sympathy for global warming policies. But instead, the animal has come to symbolize the irrational bias imposed on biology by climate politics.
If you're a grown-up, go to polarbearsos.org now. You can make sure polar bears are protected under the Endangered Species Act.
Please help them.
The polar bear as an icon for climate change is dead because the distorted predictions made by polar bear specialists were wrong. This is a lesson for researchers in other areas who have failed to stop the invasion of politics into their science.
So the polar bears are fine. There's even more of them, 4,000 or so more than there was when they were talking about how fast they were going to die off. So the polar bears are fine. Now, Snopes. How many of you know what Snopes is? It's an online fact checker, which is always kind of, anymore that's dangerous anyway. But Snopes, they are definitely not a friend to climate skepticism. When they were talking about Al Gore and his tendency to overstate problems related to climate change, said this, and I looked this up today. In the year 2007, 2008, 2009, Al Gore made statements about the possibility of a complete lack of sea ice in the Arctic by as early as 2013. While Gore attributed these predictions to scientists, they stemmed from now get this, they're saying this about Al Gore. They stemmed from a selective reading of aggressive estimates regarding future melting. In other words, he picked the worst case scenario and told you that's what was going to happen for sure. The comments became a popular talking point for human-caused climate change deniers in 2014 and onward, when the predictions, which in some cases were overstated, did not pan out. Now again, this is Snopes trying their best not to make it sound like Al Gore was wrong, which in some cases were overstated. If you read what he said, everything he said was overstated. All right? The claim that Gore predicted an ice-free Arctic in 2014 is a simplification of these events. No, he didn't predict it. He just told you a whole bunch of scientists were. Okay? However, Gore was definitely guilty in these cases of cherry-picking science or playing loose with the details of that science. You know what another word for playing loose with the data is? Lying. They're not going to call him a liar. So he was just playing loose with the data. So while the sea ice, the Arctic sea ice, is declining right now, we've seen this before across the history of the globe. And claims that polar bears are dying or that the Arctic ice is going to disappear because of global warming haven't happened. So again, every talking point, or almost every talking point, I won't say every, but almost every talking point that you find in the popular media that tells you this is why climate change is real and this is why we've got to do away with our cars or whatever, every talking point they use is wrong. The data actually says exactly the opposite. Like I said, with the exception of the sea ice declining, but again, we got historic records. This ain't the first time. And it's been worse than it is even now. Now, the question immediately becomes, why do you see the sea ice going up and down like a yo-yo? I'll tell you, and I'm definitely not got the time to get into that, and even when we talk about what the Bible has to say, I'm not going to dive into this very much. But the world to this day is still regulating itself after what happened when God sent the flood. In regards to earthquake, weather phenomena, everything else. So this cyclical up and down stuff is still the earth trying to balance itself out after the wild, crazy stuff that went on during the flood. Most likely. It's got a lot to do with it anyway. Definitely got a lot to do with what happens with earthquakes. I can prove that one. So, that's what the science really says. The observational data. Not the models, the observational data. Is that it's not, yeah, it's happening, but it's not nearly as big a thing to panic about as they want you to. Remember what I said? You never let a good crisis go to waste. Even if you have to say exactly the opposite of what the data says. Questions or comments? Questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. What she was saying is National Geographic, even as early as the 1980s, were talking about how the baby polar bears were going to drown because there wasn't any ice from the rest of them. Right. Yeah. Oh, that they were not drowning because they were, yeah. Okay. Okay, I understand now. That because they were designed to be in the water, they were fine. Ain't that amazing? Somebody else? Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. 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 It's cyclical. Yeah. Right. Yep. And that, again, that's the cyclical nature. I mean, right now, the droughts, if you listen to Weather Channel, one of the big things they talk about with the droughts out in the West right now is because of climate change. But the truth is, this is a very strong La Nina that's off the coast of California. And the La Nina weather phenomena actually has a tremendous impact on the amount of moisture that hits California. And so it's not really due to climate change. We've had La Ninas and El Ninos forever. But it's just we're right now in a very strong La Nina cycle, and that's why you're seeing so much more, it looks like a lot more drought in that particular area. And now when the El Ninos come in, they're going to get flooded. But, because the El Ninos always follow the La Ninas. It may be 2 or 3 years, but they'll always come in one right after the other. So then you're going to hear about, and then it'll be the flooding is caused by global warming. No, it's going to be because of the El Nino. But you just have to watch it. Somebody else. Somebody else. Next time, we'll start talking about what does the Bible say about this. How do we apply the Bible to climate change? Father, we love you. Thank you for the time and your word that you've given us tonight. Father, I thank you that there is information out there. There's data out there that we can use to help inform our opinions, and then we can go to the Word of God to see how we should react and respond to what's really going on. Father, I pray now that you just use me, guide me as we try to get into this next piece of this, that it'll be a help and an encouragement. Open our eyes maybe to exactly what all the Bible does say in relation to this topic so that we can be better informed and a better witness for you. We love you. Give you the praise for it all. In Jesus' name, amen.